Slavery is probably one of the most heinous phenomena in human history, yet it emerged with the rise of the first civilizations and, as a social institution, ceased to exist only quite recently. The history of slavery spans many peoples, civilizations, and societies. The practice of owning living people existed in many, if not all, cultures. However, the social, economic, and legal status of slaves varied greatly in different eras and regions. Ancient Rome is considered a classic slave-owning state. It can be said that slave labor was the main source of wealth and power for the Roman Empire, but it also became the main reason for its decline. The life of Roman slaves was especially harsh because inhumane treatment of enslaved people was considered normal and was commonplace. In this video, we will talk about how people became Roman slaves, what kinds of work they were used for, and how the life of a Roman slave differed in the master's house and on the plantation. You will also learn how much a slave cost in ancient Rome, what kinds of torture and punishments were practiced for disobedient slaves, and whether a Roman slave could gain freedom. I'm Semyon, opening the How Did They Live the series. Let's start. Where were slaves sourced? The main source of slaves in ancient Rome, as in antiquity in general, was war, or more precisely, the conquest campaigns carried out by the Roman state. It was the captured foreigners who made up the overwhelming majority of slaves in ancient Rome. This is confirmed by numerous written sources, particularly tombstone inscriptions. Prisoners were brought from Spain, Gaul, all over the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East. Anyone could become a prisoner and thus a slave, no matter their status, even foreign rulers. For the Romans, it didn't really matter, because in their view, all foreigners were barbarians. This is an important point that largely explains the cruel and inhumane treatment of slaves by the Romans. Slave traders usually followed the army on campaigns, visiting battlefields, conquered cities and territories. There they bought human merchandise in bulk at the lowest price, so they could later sell it profitably in the metropolis. During peacetime, slave traders traveled to the Middle East or Africa, where extreme poverty often led people to sell fellow tribesmen into slavery. Rome's history had few peaceful years. The second major source of slaves was piracy, which during certain periods of Roman history was widespread. Pirates not only captured ships, but they also raided coastal territories, selling their inhabitants into slavery. In Rome, a person could also become a slave because of debts. There was a whole procedure. The debtor was handed over to the creditor, who kept him at his home in shackles for 60 days. If the debt wasn't repaid during this time, the debtor became a slave. However, he could only be sold outside the territory of Rome. If a free woman had a relationship with a slave and didn't end it despite the owner's demands, she herself became a slave. Later, a law banned enslaving Roman citizens, allowing only foreigners to be enslaved. A Roman could become a slave only in exceptional cases, for example, for committing a serious crime, but such cases were rare. But in the countries conquered by Rome, debt slavery was quite common. Another source of slaves in Rome were the children of slaves, but their number was relatively small. There were many markets in the Roman Empire where people were traded as slaves, and the largest one was in Delos, where there were facilities that could hold up to 10,000 slaves at the same time. They could be sold wholesale, retail, at a fixed price, or at auction. Large slave markets were also located in Tanais, at the mouth of what is now the Don River, and in Aquileia, a city in the northeast of Italy near modern-day Venice. Slaves were usually displayed naked, so buyers could see the merchandise directly. Any physical defects, scars from punishment, or signs of illness all had to be visible. By their physique, their suitability for hard labor or domestic service was determined. Slaves had tags hung around their necks with the most detailed specifications: origin, age, health condition, character, and more. Slave traders were required to warn buyers about any ailments or shortcomings of a slave, such as a tendency toward disobedience or escape. Interestingly, it was not mandatory to report such vices as a passion for wine, laziness, or a tendency to steal. For slaves, these were considered commonplace and did not deserve special attention. The Romans believed that slaves from different lands had their own characteristic traits. For example, people from Crete were considered deceitful, Phrygians were thought to be timid, Dalmatians were seen as fierce, and Syrians were regarded as strong and resilient. It only remains to add that the slave trade was an extremely profitable business, so even the most noble Romans did not disdain to engage in it. In addition, the slave trade brought considerable income to the treasury. The status of slaves was instrumentum vocale, which translates from Latin as talking tool. In other words, a slave was seen as an instrument like a hammer or a shovel, but endowed with the gift of speech. His main difference from a free person lay in the realm of law, or more precisely, in the absence of any rights. Roughly speaking, the master could do whatever he wanted with his slave: kill, maim, send to a brothel, or set free. A slave in Rome was not considered a person. For example, the Aquilian law made no distinction between injuring a domestic animal and a slave. The famous Roman writer and politician Cato advised selling old bulls, sick cattle, ailing sheep, old carts, scrap iron, old and sick slaves, and anything unnecessary. Being considered property, a slave had no name, homeland, or nationality. Often a new master would give the slave a functional name like Syrian or Gaul, shovel or weaver. A slave could not have a family, make a will, or own property. True, a slave might have a small amount of personal belongings, such as simple utensils or livestock, but these also belonged to his master. In court, slaves were questioned only at the request of the parties. Their voluntary testimony had no value. A slave could not owe anyone anything, just as no one could owe him for harm or loss caused by a slave. His master was responsible for that. The union between a male and a female slave was not considered a marriage, but rather a common cohabitation that the master could end at any moment. Notably, external slaves were indistinguishable from free citizens. They dressed alike and frequented the same baths, theaters, and stadiums. Ideas to have slaves wear special collars or distinctive clothing were considered but later dropped. The Roman elite didn't want the slaves to realize how many of them there were and simply strangle their masters. What did the slaves do? Slave labor was central to the ancient economy. It was used in nearly every area of activity. The main consumer of forced labor was agriculture. Large estates were worked by hundreds, sometimes even thousands of slaves. There was a complex and strict hierarchy here. At the head of a large estate stood a slave manager, chosen from those especially close to the owner, who oversaw the other slaves' duties, resolved their disputes and conflicts, rewarded the hardworking, and punished the lazy. The manager had almost unlimited authority, especially if the masters either did not interfere in the affairs at all, or were not interested in the fate of their slaves. This position can safely be called the peak of a slave's career, because among other things, it allowed for a decent side income. The manager was supported by overseers and craftsmen. Below were many groups: field workers, vineyard hands, shepherds, cattlemen, spinners, weavers, tailors, carpenters, and joiners. In large estates, each professional group was divided into decuries headed by decurions. The second large group consisted of the so-called urban slaves, who lived mainly in cities or on wealthy villas and performed a wide variety of household tasks. Broadly speaking, Dutch scholars identified 147 role slaves held in wealthy Roman homes, though there were likely even more. Among the slaves were not just servants, doorkeepers, cooks, bakers, and wardrobe attendants, but also managers, stewards, accountants, cashiers, secretaries, and supply buyers. In wealthy Roman homes, there were always readers, secretaries, librarians, copyists, teachers, and even writers, philosophers, and sculptors, all of whom were also slaves. In addition, the lady and the master had personal attendants, valets, bath attendants, doctors, seamstresses, midwives, and barbers. Even having a meal required a whole crowd of slaves. Some set the table, others served the food, others poured the wine, and the masters wiped their hands on the hair of yet others. Slaves were often musicians, singers, dancers, or acrobats. Many masters specifically trained their slaves in various professions so they could then sell their services to anyone who wanted them. Young girls and boys were often sold to brothels or bought by wealthy Romans for sexual entertainment. In addition to slaves who belonged to private individuals, there were also state and municipal slaves in ancient Rome. They built roads, worked in mines and quarries, cleaned the sewers, and served in government workshops. In addition, state slaves held lower positions in municipalities, institutions, prisons, and temples. What was life like for slaves in ancient Rome? In the early Roman Republic, there were relatively few slaves and they were treated quite tolerably. At that time, Rome was waging wars on the territory of Italy, so the slaves, who were mostly prisoners of war, differed little from their masters in appearance, religion, language, and way of life. Usually, the master personally knew his slaves and often even lived with them under the same roof, so the slaves were perceived more as members of the family rather than as talking tools. As the empire expanded, attitudes towards slaves shifted. The grand Roman conquests of the late Republic and the early Roman Empire provided a huge influx of prisoners who were turned into slaves, and now they hardly resembled Romans, so there was no need to treat them with ceremony. At this time, the Romans turned into a nation of masters, served by entire armies of slaves, mostly foreigners driven into captivity. During the Roman conquest of Europe and the Mediterranean, it was this period that all descriptions of the terrible condition of Roman slaves refer to. Of course, rural slaves had it the worst. They were subjected to the most inhumane exploitation. The workday ran from morning to evening, and the food was very meager. They were given just enough to avoid starving to death, so the slaves wouldn't revolt or run away, and they were often shackled in chains. It's not surprising the average life expectancy of a plantation slave was only 5 to 7 years, depending on health. And it wasn't just about excessive cruelty from the owners. They simply squeezed everything they could out of these living tools. Slaves in mines and quarries faced equally harsh conditions. Even the sick and injured were forced to work under the whip until they died. In essence, being sent to the mines or a plantation was a death sentence for a slave, a long and agonizing one. Knowledge, literacy, or any useful skills greatly improved a slave's prospects. Such slaves usually ended up in city homes or workshops where life was more or less bearable. They lived in cramped but actual rooms instead of barracks, were given decent clothing, and were fed leftovers from the master's table. Among urban slaves, the best life was enjoyed by the managerial staff as well as representatives of creative professions, teachers, secretaries, writers, and philosophers. Such people often received their freedom after the master's death, but even for them, slavery was a severe ordeal as they were always under the arbitrary power of their owners. Cruel treatment of slaves in Rome was sanctioned by tradition, custom, and law, so chains, shackles, the stick, and the whip were widely used. They were considered the best tools for disciplining unruly slaves. But that wasn't all. Even minor offenses could get a slave killed with no consequences for the owner. For example, there is a well-known story where a slave was thrown into a tank of moray eels for breaking his master's vase, and Caesar ordered a slave who killed and ate his pet quail to be hanged from the mast. However, not everyone ended their life so simply. The Romans believed that slaves were insensitive beings, so they came up with the most painful and terrible punishments for them. A runaway slave could be ground up in millstones, have his head covered in tar and the skin torn from his skull, have all his limbs cut off, have his head hung up for birds of prey to eat, or simply be crucified on a cross. The worse the slaves' lives were, the harder their work, the harsher the punishments, and the more agonizing the executions, the more they hated their masters. It should be said that the authorities tried to somewhat restrain the arbitrariness that the masters inflicted on their slaves. For example, during the late Empire, laws appeared that prohibited selling slaves to the arena or for prostitution. Emperor Antoninus legalized customs letting slaves seek refuge from cruel masters in temples and at emperor statues. Constantine went even further. He equated the murder of a slave with the murder of a free person. Certain categories of slaves were granted partial civil capacity, meaning they were allowed to participate in legal relations. But don't think that everything went smoothly. That same Constantine issued a decree prescribing the death penalty for any woman who became the wife of her slave, and the slave himself was to be burned. And in general, this whole policy of easing the treatment of slaves had one simple reason. The Grand Roman conquests had ended, and with them the flow of slaves dried up. Christianity, which denied the possibility of owning a person as property, dealt the final blow to the institution of slavery. How much did slaves cost? First, a few words about the number of slaves in the Roman Empire. Scholars still argue about this topic, but it's obvious that we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Here are some facts. After Corinth was captured, 30,000 slaves were taken. After the victories in Epirus, up to 150,000 prisoners were sold into slavery. Gaius Marius captured 90,000 Teutons and 60,000 Cimbri. Plutarch believed that Caesar enslaved 1 million people. After the capture of Jerusalem, 97,000 slaves ended up in Roman hands. Now about the prices. In the Republican era, slaves fit for physical labor cost from 500 to 1,500 denarii. A handsome young man was priced at 2,500 denarii, and a girl could cost up to 6,000 denarii. If a slave had any artistic talent, his price increased. For Roman wealthy men, these prices were not unaffordable. For example, Ciceron bought himself a mansion for 870,000 denarii. In the late empire, the price of strong adult slaves was about 1820 gold solidi. A literate slave was worth around 50 solidi. A doctor or a midwife cost 60 solidi. And a young eunuch was 50 solidi. If he could sing or dance, the price went up to 70 solidi. For 1 solidus, you could buy 360 kilograms of grain. In conclusion, the slave trade became the foundation of Rome's power and wealth, but it also led to the decline of the Roman Empire. Slave labor corrupted Roman society. Slave tutors raised young masters to become libertines and drunkards, and slavery gave rise to the brutal spectacles of gladiatorial games. It made the work of farmers unprofitable. Rome's poor could not find jobs because they could not compete with free slave labor. Over time, they became an idle, dangerous, and poor crowd. Eventually, the Romans had to abandon slavery, but by then it was too late to save them. A brief restoration of mass slavery occurred during the colonization of North and South America, but that's a completely different story. That's all from me. Goodbye, everyone.